everybody. Welcome everyone to RCEDC's Navigating the Future question and answer portion of our program. Thank you all for joining us today and for submitting your thought-provoking questions. A special thanks to the man of the hour, Jack Uldrich, who I will fully introduce in just a few moments. For our audience, if you haven't done so already, I'd like to invite you to visit RCEDC's navigatingthefuture2020.com and watch Jack's full presentation. His top 10 list is loaded with ideas that many leaders will want to consider implementing. Also on this site are this year's award winners that include QA Shakur II, Frank Sturban, Sewall Development, and OneGuard Partners. Finally, RCEDC's President Greg Barron highlights the value of investing in RCEDC. Several of RCEDC's investors were also sponsors for today's program. Our exclusive sponsor is Johnson Financial Group. Our premier sponsors are Ashley Capital and Lee & Associates, Aurora Healthcare, Kapoor & Associates, MRA, Riley Construction, SC Johnson, US Bank, Wintrust Commercial Banking at Town Bank, and our supporting sponsors are Baird, Butterbuds, Gateway Techno College, Keller, Land & Lakes and Newmark Knight Frank, and Pitts Brothers. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Jack Uldrich. No one is able to predict the future, but our guests can help us prepare for it. Jack is a leading futurist, author, and speaker who helps organizations gain the critical foresight they need to create a successful future. His work is based on the transformational principles of unlearning, or freeing yourself from obsolete knowledge and assumptions, as a strategy to survive and thrive in an era of change. Jack will argue that creativity and action are more powerful and versatile than knowledge. He's here today with RCEDC to share his energy, anecdotes, and thoughtful business advice to educate, entertain, and inspire us. So with that background, Jack, I got a couple of questions for you, so let's begin with sharing a few questions.
All right, great.
All right, so many of your top 10 statements that are listed in the Navigating the Future 2020 program were provocative, but the Think the Unthinkable was remarkable. Do you have any examples how some leaders are implementing this individually or company-wide, and any outcomes for early results?
I do. I think one of the most important things to do is I call it a pre-mortem, and there are a number of businesses that do this. A pre-mortem is opposite of a post-mortem. Typically, a business goes bankrupt and Harvard Business Review and other business leaders try and learn from what that business did wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. But a pre-mortem has a lot more humility baked into it. And a company asks that question of themselves. They say, it's 5 years in the future and we're out of business. What didn't we see coming? And now that sounds like a really depressing question, but I would argue what it does is at first it engenders a really candid conversation about the type of change and the threats that a company might experience. But once they have identified the threats to their business, the conversation then pivots to say, if X does happen, what do we need to do? And suddenly they begin preparing for unthinkable things. They begin challenging assumptions. They begin thinking innovatively. And so that would be my advice. Unfortunately, there are very few companies who do this. And so I wish I had more concrete examples for you of businesses who have specifically done this, but in my book, Foresight 2020, I had a whole chapter on unthinkable things, and I wrote it in 2012. And one of the things that I did encourage all businesses to think about was the possibility of a global pandemic. There are 2 whole pages on it, and I said, here are all the questions you should be thinking about. What might it do to your supply chain and things like that? But my point is, think about unthinkable things. And you first have to just pose that question to your team, your staff, and even your customers.
Good insights. So given RCEDC is hosting this discussion, I have a bit of a selfish question. What can we or other economic development organizations do to support the imagine the unimaginable opportunities that may result from our current economic times.
I tell you, imagination is absolutely critical. I think one of the first things you can do is just remind people of how fast the world can change. In some of my presentations, I sometimes show a picture of New York City in 1903. And what's fascinating about it is the roads are clogged with horses. I then show that exact same street just 10 years later in 1913, and it's clogged with automobiles. My point is, it was a remarkable period of change from 1903 to 1913. And if you were in the horse industry, your world was about to change. So sort of remind people of how fast the world can change. And you might think, oh, well, that's just a historical example. We're not going to see similar change like that. That's not true. 10 years ago, Uber and Airbnb were barely existent. And in the last 10 years, they transformed the taxi and the hotel industry. And you might think, well, that was in the past. But then just think about e-commerce. In the first 2 months of the pandemic, in April and May, e-commerce grew as much as it had in the last 10 years. I mean, that's absolutely remarkable. And it's why Amazon added $1 trillion to its market capitalization. So I think one of the important things for organizations like yours is open people's minds and just explain to them why there are reasons to be optimistic about the future. And going back to Amazon, I know that there are already 2 distribution facilities in Racine County that have opened, maybe 2 more are going to open. But I tell you, within the last few months, they've suddenly entered into negotiations with Sears and JCPenney, who are in a world of hurt, and they're going to convert some of that retail space to distribution space. And then the FAA just announced 10 days ago that they are going to allow Amazon and others to begin making drone deliveries. Our world is going to change really quickly. And there are a lot of reasons to be both scared, but also to be optimistic. But I tell you, I think that our imagination muscles have absolutely atrophied over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It used to be in America that progress was viewed as a positive thing, but so many people fear change. But I'm here to tell you, the advances in online education, renewable energy, telemedicine, I mean, there is a way for us to begin addressing a lot of the problems that still are real issues in America, but there are a lot of reason to be optimistic. But we first have to trigger that imagination muscle, and organizations like yours are absolutely critical in doing that.
Thank you. So you brought up Amazon and other large e-commerce industry. With one question that came in from a business owner that is of a smaller scale, and specifically this party wrote, as a small business owner with limited financial and staff resources trying to recalibrate our business at this time, what would you say are the top 3 recommendations for us to focus on in implementation?
First, let me just say, I want to acknowledge, how difficult the retail sector is right now, but there is reason for optimism. I think many people sort of look at Amazon and see how big and fast it is growing. Let me just give you another analogy. I think 20 years ago, most futurists, most people, when they were looking at the beer industry, they said, oh my gosh, the Anheuser-Busch's, the Millers, the Heinekens, they're just going to keep getting bigger. But that's not what happened. It was the craft brewing industry that exploded, and that caught a lot of people by surprise. So the reason I say that is Amazon, of course, is a real power, and it is a real threat. But I think at the end of the day, what a lot of customers want is to support local business. So just first have some optimism if you're in the retail sector. My first piece of advice is, there's that old saying, make hay while the sun is shining. And the sun isn't shining right now, but the corollary to that is sharpen your tools while it's raining. So my guess is many people have already looked at what they can be doing to reduce their existing costs, but I'd encourage them to go a little bit farther. There are new emerging technologies in sensor technology and renewable energy. Might you be able to begin lowering your energy costs by making some modest investments in that? Item number 2, find just 1 or 2 areas where you're willing to experiment, a small pilot project. I know you don't have a lot of resources, financial resources, but is there just something you can do, new, different, innovative, a new product, new outreach? The third thing I would say, and this is where it gets really difficult, especially in difficult times, is you want to conserve all of your costs. But if I have any advice, if you have any resources, just invest a little bit in the future. I think the mistake that most business owners make is they overinvest in what has worked in the past. What you have to do in this new world that has changed so much is invest a little bit more in what could be. Is there a new product, a new service, a new way of doing business, a new business model? And I know this is difficult, but try to find a little bit and invest in the future. So those would be my 3 recommendations.
Thank you. So speaking of the new and kind of a changing future, the next question that we received was a bit of a disruptive kind of question. Since so many industries have adapted to working remotely, what are some ways you're seeing existing office space being reinvented or reused?
Oh, that's a really good question. I just had a talk to NIA, which is a big commercial real estate company. And I think the first thing to understand is, yes, remote work is real, and it is really hurting the commercial real estate space. But how do you begin viewing the world differently? I think that maybe not all businesses, but some businesses will come back to the commercial real estate space. But here's what's going to be interesting. In the past, the real estate industry was focused on sort of lowering the square footage per person. How do we make office space as efficient as possible? Well, in this new world of COVID, suddenly we're going to want more space. So maybe your existing property is sufficient. There are just going to be fewer workers coming back into it. I also think we've already seen there's a company called Republic who the hotel industry is in a world of hurt, and they're already converting hotel properties into affordable housing. Affordable housing is still a real issue, and I suspect it is in Racine County. Could some of the hotels begin being retrofitted into affordable housing? Yes, that's a possibility. Another one, this was really exciting. In Montreal, just 10 days ago, some real estate opened the world's largest urban rooftop farm. Urban farming is a real trend, and we're going to want to grow fresh organic produce as close to customers as possible. So could some property owners begin thinking about retrofitting their property into urban farms? Absolutely, that's a possibility. Another possibility, the retail space that Amazon is hammering, there are some innovative property owners who are saying, you know, another issue we have is senior housing, and they're converting once thriving malls into mixed use housing for both childcare and senior living. I think you just have to be prepared to think differently. Wherever there are problems, there are going to be opportunities, but you're going to have to think about them. You're going to have to be innovative, and you're going to have to take some modest risks in the future. But I think there are plenty of reasons for the real estate space to be optimistic.
Excellent. So speaking, I guess, still of remote and use of real estate differently, the next question is, in a future that maintains and expands virtual workplaces, what advances are you seeing to maintain more personable connections amongst coworkers, colleagues, and so on?
Oh, that's a really good question. But first, I would think, let's just remind ourselves of Zoom and these other platforms are going to get better. But I think one of the really interesting developments out of this is in face-to-face meetings, 50% of all people are introverts, and they don't feel comfortable contributing in face-to-face meetings. What they're now discovering is in Zoom calls where there is some distance, they are more likely to participate. They might be participating in chat. So we're already seeing a more human connection, or we're tapping into the talent of everyone in our teams through this new medium. But I think that in the future, you're going to continue to see advances that, well, I think one of the really interesting developments to watch is the space of virtual reality. I mean, today they're sort of unwieldy goggles, but that technology, because of the pandemic, is getting really, really good. And we're actually going to get better at being able to see people's facial reactions and other things like that. And as that technology improves, so much of human communication isn't through just words, it is through seeing people's eyes, their facial reactions. And as technology begins to improve our ability to do that, we're going to get a little bit closer to face-to-face communication. And then the third technology that I think is going to make our virtual world a little bit better is augmented reality. We're soon going to be able to begin layering digital information onto our cameras, and charts and other visual information will get better at figuring out how to supplement our verbal words with visual information.
Interesting. So speaking of more disruption, the next question we have switches gears from real estate and workplaces to more specifically some international questions. Do you foresee the expulsion of US subsidiaries from mainland China in the next 4 years?
You know, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't necessarily foresee expulsion. I do, however, see many US companies voluntarily, and other multinationals voluntarily withdrawing from China. I think first part of that will be candid, or China was less than candid with the seriousness of COVID. And so I think that they have a long way to go to rebuild trust with American businesses. And some American businesses will say, we can't trust them and we want to come back to the United States. But I also think the other thing that the pandemic has accelerated is just changes to the global supply chain. We've suddenly understood how vulnerable the global supply chain is. And what businesses are understanding is the bottom line is no longer just efficiency, hyper efficiency. The bottom line is actually resilience. And you actually have to build into your supply chain what I call strategic inefficiency. And that means that we have to begin bringing our supply chain back to the United States so that we can produce things much closer to the customer. I think we'll still produce some things in China, but we're also going to try and produce things a lot closer to the customer. And advances in additive manufacturing or 3D printing are going to allow a lot of physical products to begin being reshored to America.
Interesting. I want to mention we did have one request in our chat just to give some information as to where to find Jack's full presentation. It is on the navigatingthefuture2020.com website. We also have a link on RCDC's website. And then today's presentation will be on RCDC's website once it's edited and these wrinkles are removed. So that might take some extra time, but that will be posted on RCDC's website too. So Jack, the next question is, how do I as a leader help my team understand that the new normal is abnormal?
Well, I think you can't say that enough, is that people have to understand that change is accelerating and it's going to continue to accelerate. But I think what you need to do is just remind people of, first, as a leader, just remind people how much they have changed in the last 6 months. The idea that they are now working remotely, that their kids are doing online education, that they're engaging in telemedicine, that we're doing virtual conferences like this, that we're having virtual happy hours with our friends. So they've already gone through a lot of change. And I think as a leader, just remind people of that and give your employees and colleagues credit for the massive amount of change they've already adopted to. But now I think the challenge for leaders is to say change fatigue is real, but to remind them change isn't going to slow down. We've all heard the statement, but it's 3,000 years old. The only constant is change, and that's true. The difference is the pace of change is what is so different today. So that next, the leaders have to explain why there are reasons to be optimistic about all of this change. And one of the things I just like to do as a leader myself is always remind people of personal changes that people have gone through and say, think about a change that was difficult at the time, but did you come out better? And most people will say, yes, I did. And so I think it just goes to this point of reminding people of the positive aspects of change. But my third point is this, and this is the challenge of leadership. If you dislike change, you're going to dislike irrelevance even more. The only alternative is to change. And so as a leader, we have to begin creating a culture of flexibility and adaptability. People always get Darwin's quote wrong. They think, oh, it's survival of the fittest. That is not what he said. He said, those that survive are those that are fastest to adapt and evolve. And so we're all going to have to adapt and evolve.
Yeah, challenging statements. That's hard. It's easy to say that, but to actually accept it. I mean, there's a whole school of thought about change management and how so often change fails. So it's a difficult challenge for businesses, large and small, to create that environment that is such to support change and adapting nature, as you say.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jenny. And I would say you mentioned a key word, failure. And if I have any advice for leaders, it is failure is not a bad word. I mean, in a world that is changing as much as ours is, I told businesses earlier, do some experiments, try pilot projects. You know what? Some of those things aren't going to work out. But you know what? Those aren't failures. Those are just another method of learning. And to go back to that pre-mortem, there are companies who now, some of the companies, there are two really innovative companies. I forget the name of the companies specifically that do this, but one has a monthly heroic failure award. And this CEO, she said, look, I really want to encourage innovation in my business because it's critical to our success. But you know what? I know that some of the things we try aren't going to work. But rather than punishing those failures, she rewards it. She said, these people took a risk. They used the best information at the time. And you know what? Things didn't work out. But rather than punish it, they learned from it. And that really helps create a culture of innovation and creativity. Another CEO, he knows his tendency to punish failure. And I think we've all worked for bosses like this. You messed up, you're in trouble. Well, that culture isn't going to work in the future. So he recognized that. And what he did is he gave every one of his employees two made up, or he just sort of copied the Monopoly free get out of jail card. And he said, look, I want you to be creative and innovative. But if some of your things don't work out and I come and try and punish you, you just have to hand me one of the free get out of jail cards and I'll back off. I thought that was a really good example of someone recognizing his own biases and sort of developing a mechanism that would help create a really creative and innovative culture.
That's a great idea. One question that was received was, how will robotics and artificial intelligence in manufacturing impact the U.S. labor force?
We have to have a candid conversation about this. You read so many articles who will say, well, advances in artificial intelligence are going to transform jobs, but they're not going to eliminate jobs. And I think that this is unfortunately not a true statement. The advances in robotics and artificial intelligence are absolutely real. And let me just take both of them separately. The advances in artificial intelligence, what people need to understand is that trend is accelerating exponentially, but artificial intelligence does not care about the color of your collar. Artificial intelligence isn't just going to put blue collar workers out of work, although that is going to happen. Amazon and others are talking about cashierless stores, and they're using artificial intelligence to make their stores hyper efficient. But advances in artificial intelligence are going to eliminate some jobs in banking, in finance, in radiology, in healthcare, and in the legal profession. That is simply a fact. The advances in robotic technology are also getting really good. I didn't mention this, but in the real estate space, now people have to keep their properties really, really clean. And where they once had janitorial services, they're now using robotic technology to clean the buildings and to sanitize the buildings. So all of this is to say there is going to be some job loss. And I think the job loss is going to occur faster than we can create new industries. There are going to be new industries and new jobs happening in the future, but there's going to be a mismatch. And so I think we're going to have more federal and state funding to help people train for new jobs. But I think the really big change that is coming is, I don't want to say that STEM isn't important. It is absolutely critical. We still need kids studying science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But the jobs of the future, the jobs that robotics and artificial intelligence cannot do, are those jobs that rely on creativity, empathy, imagination, compassion, and even love, the human elements. But now let me just step back and say this about the future. That might sound really depressing, how fast artificial intelligence and robotics are going to displace jobs, but let me just give you a historical analogy. If I was a futurist 100 years ago, and if I had the opportunity to come and speak to people in Racine County, 50% of the audience would have been farmers. And if I was a good futurist 100 years ago, I would have said, oh, in the future, we're only going to need 2% of you. The immediate thought in that audience would have been, oh my God, what are we all going to do? My point is, it's easy to see the jobs that are going to go away. What is difficult to understand is those jobs and industries and professions that aren't yet created. 100 years ago, I think you would have been able to forecast the growth of the automobile industry. You might have been able to predict the growth of the airline industry, but the radio industry, the television industry, computers, internet, social media, renewable energy, no way. You wouldn't have been able to do it. And in the same way, we have to recognize that just because we can't imagine new jobs and new industries does not mean that someone else won't be able to imagine those things. And this is, Jenny, why it gets back to imagination. I think if you ever as a leader find yourself saying, I can't imagine, give yourself a timeout and say, just because you can't imagine something doesn't mean that someone else can't. And this is why we need small business owners, entrepreneurs. The jobs and the industries of the future are going to come from the minds of our kids and ourselves. And so I'm actually really optimistic that there are even jobs and industries that, as a futurist, I have not yet been able to imagine. But I'm holding space in my mind for things in better education. How do we utilize online some of these technological tools to teach our kids better? How do we leverage some of these technologies to engage in preventative healthcare? How do we get into aggressively renewable energy? How do we begin leveraging technologies to create more affordable housing? How do we make this world a better place? As long as there are problems, there's still opportunities for businesses, and we all need to open our mind, get a lot more imaginative and creative than we are today.
Yeah, you, Jack, have answered a lot of questions, and I cannot believe how quickly our time has gone by. I'm sorry we were not able to get to all the questions that were submitted. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I want to thank Jack for your foresight, for your ongoing research, and for your sharing of information with us once again, because this is a repeat. We had you at an annual meeting back in, I believe it was 2014, and it was the highest rated annual meeting at that time. So we needed to bring you back, and I'm sure we'll bring you back again. So thank you for your time and for our audience. And with that, I'll close our program for this morning.